When I first heard about what happened to Farah, I was in disbelief. How could a group of ordinary people commit such a horrific act? What shocked me even more was how some tried to justify it, saying she brought it on herself for allegedly insulting the faith. But is that really what faith teaches? Can justice be delivered with violence? This story still chills me, and today, we're diving into this difficult case. This is not just about Farah, but about how women in society constantly face challenges, often having to prove their innocence simply for existing. While some may want to forget what happened, we must remember so that such injustice never happens again. It was March 2015 in Kabul, the city buzzing with preparations for Nowruz, the Persian New Year celebrated in Afghanistan on March 21st or 22nd. Farah Malekzada, like her family, was getting ready for the holiday. Her faith, which had guided her since childhood, was central to her life. But that same faith would be at the heart of the events that ultimately changed her life forever. On Thursday, March 19th, Farah left her home as usual, intending to attend her Quran studies. Before leaving, she spent peaceful moments with her family, kissing her little nephew, sharing kind words with her mother, and promising to return soon. The house was filled with the scent of spices from Farah's cooking, as she was responsible for preparing the holiday meal. Smiling, she assured her family that everything would be ready in time. However, instead of going directly to her lesson, she stopped at one of her favorite places, the Shadu Shamshira Mosque, a majestic building near the Kabul River. Farah always found peace here, and her visits had become a comforting ritual. She often spoke with the elderly caretaker, Zainuddin, a kind and wise man who shared his knowledge of religion with her. Their conversations brought her tranquility and spiritual strength. Farah's devotion to her faith was deep and unwavering. She had memorized many Quranic verses and often recited them for confidence during difficult times. Her modesty and sincerity were evident to all who knew her. Though her personal dreams of marriage and family had not yet materialized, she remained hopeful, trusting in her faith and future. On that March day, as Farah left the mosque, everything seemed normal. But the events that followed would change her life and the lives of those who knew her forever. At the gates of the mosque, Farah noticed amulets being sold with symbols she believed went against Islamic teachings. Outraged, she confronted the seller, Zainuddin, which would lead to an unexpected and tragic turn of events. This story is a reminder of the dangers of misunderstanding and violence. Farah's life, and the injustice that followed, must never be forgotten. Many believed in the power of these items, and they were willing to pay for them, he said casually. But Farah couldn't accept this explanation. She tried to convince him that such practices contradicted her faith, explaining that these weren't just simple objects but a misuse of sacred texts. The tension between them increased with every word. Farah held one of the amulets in her hand, its cold beads sliding through her fingers, and carefully unwrapped the paper inside. It contained a small fragment of a sacred verse, but the words were taken out of context, surrounded by symbols that resembled magical signs. Farah felt a surge of anger and fear. To her, this wasn't just disrespect, it was a violation of something sacred, twisting it for deceitful purposes. Zala noticed her reaction and began speaking more softly, as if trying to reassure her. "These amulets can work wonders," he said, his voice calm. "They can heal illness, bring good fortune, protect from harm, and even help a woman who desires to have children." Farah was shocked by his words. She couldn't believe that he was so confidently selling false promises, presenting them as truth. But what troubled her even more was what else she saw in the stall, items that seemed completely out of place alongside sacred objects. Among the amulets and beads were packs of pills. Her eyes caught sight of products that, to her, represented a deep disregard for the traditions she held dear. Her anger grew, and she could no longer contain it. She raised her voice, accusing Zalan of disrespecting the faith and misleading devout people. She demanded that he stop selling these items and close his stall. Their argument became more intense, and soon a crowd gathered around them, watching the heated exchange. As their confrontation escalated, Zalan, his voice now shaking, suddenly shouted to the crowd, "This woman disrespected sacred texts." His accusation shocked the onlookers, their faces reflecting disbelief and judgment. Farah, keeping her composure, clearly stated, "I am a person of faith, and I would never disrespect the holy text." But her words were drowned out by the growing whispers of anger in the crowd. Misinformation spread quickly, and the crowd's mood darkened. In the chaos, Farah's attempts to explain herself were ignored, and the crowd grew more aggressive. Some began filming the scene on their phones, further fueling the situation. Despite her pleas for calm, the crowd's anger reached a boiling point, and in the confusion, things took a violent turn. Farah fell to the ground as the situation spiraled out of control. The scene escalated until the authorities arrived, attempting to restore order, but the damage had already been done. Shots fired into the air briefly paused the escalating chaos, causing some men to back away. Farah, sitting on the cold pavement, tried to shield herself from the blows, covering her face with her hands. Her disheveled hair hung down, and her chatter, knocked from her head, lay on the ground beside her. An officer reached out to help her up and offered to take her to the station. Despite her pain and humiliation, she refused, asking for a female officer instead, unwilling to let any man touch her. The crowd continued to swell, shouting accusations and filming the scene on their phones, spreading the chaos further. At some point, the situation escalated. The police, realizing they were losing control, tried to maintain order but were unable to stop the growing unrest. As tension peaked, the crowd's anger turned violent. Farah, overwhelmed by the situation, faced a terrifying moment as some individuals acted in a way that was beyond reason. Despite attempts to intervene, the situation spiraled out of control. Meanwhile, just a few miles away, Farah's home remained peaceful. Her family, unaware of the events unfolding in the city, went about their daily routines. They were preparing for an upcoming celebration, expecting Farah to return soon. Her father received a phone call that shattered their peace, summoning them to the scene of the chaos. Fear and confusion gripped the family as they rushed to the location. Upon arriving, they were met with a scene of disorder and anger. Confused and fearful, they searched for answers, but none came. An officer eventually led them away, informing them of an incident involving Farah. At the police station, investigators hinted that the situation could be quickly resolved if the family agreed to sign documents implying that Farah had been suffering from mental health issues. Her father, however, refused, knowing his daughter was healthy and unwilling to accept such a narrative. What followed was a heart-wrenching moment no parent ever expects. The investigators broke the news that Farah had passed away. Her family was devastated, unable to comprehend the loss. They were later taken to identify her body, a moment filled with unimaginable grief. The events of that day quickly spread on social media, capturing widespread attention. As videos surfaced, so did the outrage. Some individuals attempted to justify the actions of the crowd, while others, including Afghanistan's President Ashraf Ghani, condemned the violence, calling it a national tragedy and demanding justice for Farah. In the aftermath, an investigation revealed that the accusations against Farah were false, leading to a public reckoning. Many who initially defended the violence retracted their statements, but the damage was done. Though some officials were removed from their positions, the pain and loss Farah's family endured remained irreversible. They returned to Kabul to lay Farah to rest, their hearts heavy with grief but determined to honor her memory. The funeral took place on March 22nd, just 3 days after the tragedy. The crowd that gathered was as large as the one that had gathered earlier, but this time they came in mourning, not anger. Afghan women took on a rare and powerful role, carrying Farah's coffin in defiance of tradition, which typically reserved this task for men. When some men offered to assist, the women waved them away, shouting, "Where were you when 15 men attacked Farah? Where were you then?" Just 2 days later, on March 24th, thousands of women marched through the streets of Kabul. They held signs that read, "We are all Farah," and many had their faces painted red, symbolizing the blood that had been shed. The protest was a cry for justice, demanding the respect and rights that Afghan women had been denied for so long. It was not only women in the crowd, men also marched alongside their wives, sisters, and mothers, showing their support and solidarity. This demonstration became one of Afghanistan's most significant civil movements in years, with many hoping it would mark the start of real change. After the crime against Farah shocked the nation, 49 men were arrested. However, the investigation revealed these were not extremists or radicals, but ordinary people, men from various walks of life. They looked like typical city dwellers, wearing jeans and t-shirts, not the kind of people typically associated with violence. This fact made Farah's case even more alarming. As the trial progressed, people across the country and around the world watched in anticipation, hoping for justice. Yet on May 5, 2015, the verdicts caused widespread disappointment. Out of the 49 men, 26 were acquitted, sparking outrage among those following the case. Even more frustrating was that 11 police officers who stood by without intervening were sentenced to just 1 year in prison. Many questioned how a 1-year sentence could compare to the life they failed to protect. Only 8 civilians were sentenced to 16 years, and 4 were given the death penalty, including Zulan, the mosque caretaker who had first accused Farah. Among the convicted was Yaqub, a 16-year-old boy who had been swept up in the violence. He had been an ordinary boy, dreaming of becoming an athlete, until that day. Footage captured him throwing a stone at Farah, an act that would forever change his life and devastate his family. Despite the initial sentences, the appeals court later reduced them. On July 2, 2015, in a closed session, the death penalties were overturned. 3 men received 20 years, while Yaqub's sentence was reduced to just 10 years. This sparked a new wave of protests, as people expressed their anger over what they saw as leniency for such a horrific crime. Even more shocking was that the 11 police officers who had been sentenced to 1 year were soon released on bail, with some returning to their positions. Afghanistan's First Lady, Ruhollah Ghani, openly expressed her dismay and called for change, recognizing that the country had been living under the shadow of violence for too long. Her words resonated with many, but the question remained, would anything actually change? Farah's family, who had fled Kabul after the tragedy, returned to say their final goodbyes. But they knew that justice had been elusive. The trial reflected the ongoing struggles of women in Afghanistan, where violence and discrimination remained entrenched. A year later, on March 23, 2016, a memorial was unveiled in Kabul in Farah's honor. Her story had become a symbol of the fight for women's rights in a society where injustice was still the norm. Despite the protests, the renamed streets, and the new rules at the mosque where the tragedy occurred, the reality for women had not improved. Social media became a space where Afghan women shared stories of continued harassment and fear. Some even blamed Farah for her own death, distorting the facts and shifting responsibility onto the victim. This deepened the divide between those seeking change and those upholding the status quo. But amid the darkness, there were glimmers of hope. Activists continued to speak out, refusing to let Farah's story be forgotten. They gathered at protests, declaring that they would fight for every woman who had been lost or rejected by society. They understood that the road ahead would be long, but they were determined to keep pushing for change. Farah's story serves as a reminder that symbols alone, like memorials and renamed streets, are not enough. True change must come from how society treats and values women. Without a collective effort to address these deeper issues, tragedies like Farah's will continue to happen. Her legacy must inspire ongoing action, not just remembrance, so that future generations can live in a world where justice prevails and all women are protected.